In studying the development of the world's major religions, there are singular figures whose fate influences whether a faith survives, wholly transforms, or utterly dies out before its doctrines mature. One singular character of controversy who died well before his prime was Flavius Claudius Julianus, whom history knows as Julian the Apostate, Caesar of the Western Roman Empire from 355 to 360, and Roman Emperor from 361 to 363. Julian not only produced more extant writings than any other Roman emperor, he was also the last emperor to be initiated in the pagan mysteries and ultimately the last pagan emperor. Julian was born to Christian parents in Constantinople to one of the most prominent and influential families of the empire. His father was Julius Constantius, the half-brother to Constantine the Great, who was known for his role in decriminalizing Christian practice in the empire and priming Rome for its later total adoption of Christianity. When Julian was 6 years old, Constantine died, and his 3 sons became co-emperors per a declaration of the Roman army. Upon the ascension of Constantius II and his 2 brothers, a shadowy conflict of assassinations purged the co-emperors of competitors, including Julian's own Christian father, putting young Julian in a very dangerous position. This series of murders would come to be called the Massacre of the Princes, and ultimately, Constantius II would emerge as sole Augustus. Julian and his half-brother Gallus were spared due to their youth, and for being the last male heirs Constantius had. Julian was not ignorant of the tragedy of his youth brought on by Constantius, saying in his own words, "Our fathers were brothers, sons of the same father. 6 of my cousins and his, and my father who was his own uncle, and also another uncle of both of us on the father's side, and my eldest brother, he put to death without a trial. And as for me and my other brother, he intended to put us to death, but finally inflicted exile upon us." After being moved around from Nicomedia and back to the capital, Julian and his half-brother are exiled to an isolated imperial estate in Cappadocia, where for 6 years the 2 boys would basically be prisoners. Julian remarks that he lived here in glittering servitude. No friends were allowed to visit him, and he shared in the exercises of the slaves. But during these years, also Julian discovered the kindling of a great intellectual and spiritual fire that would stoke in his heart and burn loud until his dying day. He developed a passion for books, reading the Christian scriptures, and also coming to love Homer and Hesiod, per the influence of his beloved tutor Mardonius. It is clear from this point that Julian clung to a suspicion about Christianity, which would have played into his relationship with the scriptures. We must remember around this time, too, since 341 AD, Emperor Constantius banned sacrifice at the old temples, gods, and statues under threat of severe punishment. Julian would have come across the Christian tenets that rule against murder, but remembered how nearly his whole family had been slaughtered by a would-be Christian. Indeed, the Christians were never unified in any case, and would pick and choose which laws of Moses they would obey and disobey on a daily basis. How then could a Christian ruler push his faith on a pagan heritage and yet not abide by the very laws he seeks to lord over his subjects? Julian also criticized his Christian teachers for their attempts at biblical literalism, conveying the young man's early aptitude for detecting the symbolic layers of mythology and the creative license exercised by the famed Greek poets. In one of Julian's most profound later writings, in his hymn to King Helios, he would recall, "From my childhood an extraordinary longing for the rays of the god penetrated deep into my soul, and from my earliest years my mind was so completely swayed by the light that illumines the heavens that not only did I desire to gaze intently at the sun, but whenever I walked abroad in the night season, when the firmament was clear and cloudless, I abandoned all else without exception and gave myself up to the beauties of the heavens. Nor did I understand what anyone might say to me, nor heed what I was doing myself. I was considered to be over-curious about these matters and to pay too much attention to them, and people went so far as to regard me as an astrologer when my beard had only just begun to grow. While in exile, Julian was baptized at a local Arian church. Arian, as in the early Arian Christological doctrine known as Arianism, which held that Jesus was not co-eternal with God the Father, and further distinguished Jesus from God in a manner deemed heretical by nearly every other Christian sect. This Arian perspective is encapsulated by the founder of Arianism, Arius, in his famous quote, "If God and Christ were equal, then Christ should be called God's brother, not God's son." The level to which Arian interpretation threatened the established Christian narrative under the empire is conveyed in an edict against the Arians by the previous emperor Constantine. If any writing composed by Arius should be found, it should be handed over to the flames, so that not only will the wickedness of his teaching be obliterated, but nothing will be left even to remind anyone of him. And I hereby make a public order that if someone should be discovered to have hidden a writing composed by Arius, and not to have immediately brought it forward and destroyed it by fire, his penalty shall be death. After 6 years of exile, Julian became a devout student of philosophy, ever mindful of the fate of his father and slain cousins, and careful not to call much attention to his affairs. His most reliable description pictures him as a man with a muscular neck and chest, a straight nose, and a large lower lip, who maintained a philosopher's beard as a student. In 351, Julian is studying rhetoric back in Constantinople, but is packed off again for Nicomedia after the emperor becomes wary of Julian, who is, however much a bookworm, now on the cusp of manhood. But wherever he went, he could not keep Constantius's spies from watching him, nor could he be seen not to take up Christian duties in the church. Julian takes various philosophic travels, coming under the tutelage of the theurgist Maximus of Ephesus, who would later initiate Julian into the mysteries of Diana Cybele, the mother of the gods. Julian learned of the Neoplatonist Plotinus and Porphyry under Aedesius in Pergamum, who was himself taught by the divine Iamblichus. In this manner, Julian comes into contact with the great Platonic succession and appears to make up his mind about fully renouncing Christianity. Julian was 20 years old when his conversion to paganism was complete, a truth he would keep secret for 10 years, wherein he operated as a kind of crypto-pagan. Julian is shortly afterward initiated into the mysteries of Mithras and the cult of Hecate. One of the great haters of Julian was the narrow-minded and inflammatory Gregory of Nazianzus, a 4th century archbishop of Constantinople and theologian. Gregory writes of Julian's initiation, quote, "He descended into one of those sanctuaries feared by all, in company with the man that was as bad as many sanctuaries put together, the wise in such things, or sophist more rightly to be called. This kind of divination confers with darkness and subterranean demons." Most Christian accounts of the life of Julian are likewise unfavorable to his character, painting him as a villain and enemy of their faith, one who turned away, or an apostate. One later Christian critic of Julian, Sozomen, wrote of his death, quote, "A dying emperor looks skyward at Jesus, who descends from heaven to look upon his fallen opponent." But Julian was now a follower of an esoteric doctrine that included some of the most profound philosophic minds in history and offered new approaches to magic and deity, which the constipated tolerance of church-empowered Christians found repulsive. After his Mithraic initiation, Julian accepts Mithras as his patron god, and he also accepts Hermes as a patron of his eloquence. In 354, Julian's half-brother Gallus was summoned back to Milan after Gallus had ruled as Caesar in the east, but made many mistakes, such as confiscating the wealth of certain royal families in Antioch and sowing spies throughout his subjects. When Gallus was recalled by Constantius, baited by hopes of being named Augustus, he stopped off in Constantinople to crown the victor of the chariot races, an honor reserved solely for the emperor. Thus, when Gallus arrived at Poetovio, he was arrested and later executed on charges of treason. Julian, knowing of his brother's fate, is also summoned to Milan, where he connects with Empress Eusebia, who would later become a pivotal ally. But Julian was not put to death, nor could he be accused of any crime, despite his fear of walking into one of the emperor's traps. Instead, Julian travels to Athens to excitedly resume his studies under new teachers. In Athens, he learns at the famous Platonic Academy and meets his nemesis, Gregory of Nazianzus, who attended some of the same lectures as Julian. During his several-month stay in Athens, Julian is initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries, the oldest mystery cult known to the world, where people from all around the known world had been traveling to for the great processions and rituals for over 1,000 years. It is at this point that a true initiate of his time finds himself under the shadow of a Christian emperor who murdered his family. Julian sees this growing religion of the Galileans, now with new insights from the more ancient spiritual traditions of the land, that had gotten along fine without Jesus before and could well do it again. And Julian was tested on his vows of secrecy, which every initiate swears, as few others had been before him. Julian's vowed secrets to withhold details of the rites of the mysteries were now more than for the purpose of honoring the sanctity of the gods, but in fact to spare his own life. For in the background, the emperor is ever paranoid of any competition for his throne, and his agents commit various assassinations to avoid civil wars, such as that of the traitor Silvanus, the master of infantry. In 354, Julian is once again recalled to the imperial palace by Emperor Constantius, where by 355 he would be, in an unlikely twist of fate, elevated to the rank of Caesar. Of his recall, Julian wrote, "I submitted and consented to dwell under the same roof with those whom I knew to have ruined my whole family, and who I suspected would plot against myself also." Julian now finds himself to be the emperor's closest male relative, trained in no ways in military order or imperial rule. He had no respect in the army or among the trifling courtiers in the capital. In this way, however, how could he be seen as a reasonable threat to Constantius? In fact, he posed no such threat, and for all the emperor knew, he would never make a serious general. If not for the empress's fondness for Julian, the emperor may never have actually positioned Julian for a shot at imperial power in the north. And so Julian was married to the emperor's sister, Helena, and given 360 Christian bodyguards who apparently knew only how to pray. And fresh from his Platonic studies and absence from court and imperial life, Julian is tasked in 355 to represent the empire in Gaul as the new Caesar, the second in rank below the emperor. Though Julian admits he was not about to become an army leader, but rather a subordinate to two generals, Ursicinus and Marcellus, who were tasked to watch him as closely as their enemies. Indeed, when Marcellus later has the chance to come to Julian's rescue whilst Julian's troops are being besieged, Marcellus refuses, some historians believe, on orders of the emperor himself. And Gaul, with its Rhine River and its central vital place in the empire's western power structure, was found to be in far worse shape than Julian anticipated. The Germanic leader, King Chanatamar, had sacked and taken eastern Gaul with his Alemanni warriors. In fact, it was not altogether clear if Julian was put here, without immediate authority, as a mere figurehead, expected to enact some small degree of treason and be executed. But Julian did not shy away from his position, practicing with shield and sword and studying military strategy, no doubt taking inspiration from Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Aurelius. And through a harsh Gallic winter, it is said Julian never lit a fire in his bedchambers. In his first year as Caesar, Julian campaigned against the barbarians who attacked Autun and succeeded, and so begins the military career of Julian Caesar, who gradually achieved the trust of his men and offered bounties to his soldiers for killing barbarians. Indeed, the young man soon proved a capable military leader, if not from training, then by the will of his soul. There are many vignettes to this story we must pass over, such as the apparent assassination of Julian's newborn son to Helena, allegedly orchestrated by the Empress Eusebia herself, and the other various skirmishes, battles, and ambushes Julian is a part of, and the betrayals of the general Barbatio. The climax of Julian's campaigns occurred at the Battle of Strasbourg, when King Chronodomar marched his tribal confederation over the Rhine and toward the fortress of Tres Tabernae, where Julian and his 13,000 soldiers were stationed. But Julian marched out to meet King Chronodomar and his force of some 30,000 in the field. With trumpets blaring over the field, the two armies and their cavalry closed in, with King Chronodomar leading his army on foot and an ambushing force of Alemanni warriors springing out of hiding in the trees. When Julian found his center in trouble, he rode forth and exercised his skill in oration, which he had become well known for. On horseback, Julian shouts out various exhortations, such as, "Behold, my comrades, the long-wished-for day is at hand," which incites us all to wash out former stains and to restore to its proper brightness the Roman majesty. These men before you are barbarians, whom their own rage and intemperate madness have urged forward to meet with the destruction of their fortunes, defeated as they will now be by our might. When the left flank was soon to be encircled, Julian rides behind his lines and reverses the course, pushing back the ambush. But King Chronodomar, on the opposite side of the battle, countered this move when the Roman cavalry made a hastened charge on his position. When the cavalry commander was thrown from his mount and killed, the Roman cavalry turned in full retreat. At this point, Julian is said to commit a bold maneuver, taking up his purple dragon banner and riding across the entire length of the field. It is recorded by Ammianus Marcellinus, a soldier in the battle himself, that Julian rode up to his fleeing cavalry and bolstered their will to fight, saying, "Whither are we fleeing, my most valiant men? Do you know not that flight never leads to safety but shows the folly of a useless effort? Let us return to our companions to be at least sharers in their coming glory, if it is without consideration that we are abandoning them as they fight for their country." And when the Roman lines were nearly split at the center, Julian's choice auxiliaries and legions rallied and routed the enemy forces across the field, pushing the Germans into and across the Rhine, where many drowned in the river. King Chronodomar himself, however, could not escape. He fought a last stand and finally surrendered, being brought to Julian in chains. With dignity, Julian spared Chronodomar's life and sent the barbarian king back to Constantius's court, where Chronodomar would die not long afterward. This victory cost Julian only 247 men, and his enemy over 6,000. The battle won Julian the great enthusiasm of his army and dismantled the unity of the Germanic tribes, ensuring greater stability in Gaul and, unfortunately, the resurgence of enmity from Constantius. Julian was really in a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. Despite Constantius claiming the glory for himself and hearing none of the bravery of Julian in his court, Julian continued to impress, striking tribes in Gaul and seeking to force them into peace terms. From the victory at Strasbourg in 357 to 359, Julian restored northern Gaul to Roman dominance. In a testament to his character as a ruler, Julian put an end to the wealthy evading taxes through bribes and ensured that all taxes were actually collected in the north, so as not to raise them on Roman citizens. He also refused to neglect the towns he captured and sieged, and, as noted by one Roman official, these provinces which were conquered, occupied, laid waste by fire and the sword, are now more prosperous than our towns, which have never known enemy invasion, and which are in the hands of Constantius. Julian passed all his summers in campaign, his winters in administration. By some, he was regarded as the reincarnation of Titus, son of Vespasian, or as an equal to the Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius. And at some point in his life, Julian entertains the idea that he himself is a reincarnation of Alexander the Great. His experiences in Gaul gave him that knowledge craved for by all would-be rulers, and his conduct there earned him the steady respect of his soldiers. But in the east, the Persian attacks were growing, and Constantius had ambitious designs on the Persian king Sippor II, which would result in Constantius ordering a number of Julian's legions out of Gaul and far to the east, a situation Julian's soldiers saw as a direct contradiction of the conditions they were promised before setting out for Gaul. In 360 AD, the facade of cooperation between Constantius and Julian broke down, and the refusal of the emperor to pay Julian's soldiers properly and many other tensions boiled over, culminating with Julian being raised on a shield and proclaimed Augustus, a title he was reluctant to accept but did not now relinquish. Julian is said to have paid his deprived troops from his own purse, and now that he was the very embodiment of everything Constantius feared, he knew a bloody reconciliation was likely soon at hand. Julian's repeated attempts to avoid a civil war are evident in the letters he sent to the emperor and the Athenians. But when it was discovered that Constantius was bribing barbarian tribes to attack his own troops in Gaul, Julian surrendered to the momentum, resolving to take 23,000 troops from Gaul and march against the emperor. In fact, Julian was welcomed into Sirmium in modern-day Serbia, one of the then 4 capitals of the empire, with flowers and praise, and without the need to shed any Roman blood. Shortly thereafter, Constantius realized he had to face Julian, and so he gathered up troops from the east and left the Persian front, heading toward Constantinople into what would have been a battle to defend his status as Augustus, and likely a victory over the outnumbered forces of Julian. But in November of 361, the emperor fell sick with a fever, and soon knew he was dying. And while on his deathbed, Constantius is said to have finally declared Julian as his sole heir. When Julian heard the news, he headed for Constantinople to receive his crown, organize his administration, and give the dead emperor his proper burial. Finally it was that Julian could remove the veils he had so long hidden his faith beneath. It was already a wild miracle that such a young Julian could rise through military prestige from such an unlikely educational background and sweep away the empire with little loss of Roman lives. And so Julian set forth his meticulous administration with a major goal of progressing and reinstating pagan ideology, inspired to imitate the ideal emperor of Marcus Aurelius. Julian fired many of the palace staff for their luxuries and excesses, becoming sick with how large of sums were being paid to those he might have thought to be mere functionaries. Among those he fired were Christians and pagans alike. Julian decreased the staff of many bureaucracies and thereby freed up funds to spend on more important matters, such as restoring the cities of Greece. Julian's personal behavior, too, embodied the changes one could foresee under his rule. He refrained from the gluttonies that had caused some of his predecessors to induce vomiting in order to stuff more food down their throats. Julian rarely consumed alcohol, dressed simply, and had even taken a vow of chastity after his wife's death. In Antioch, Julian was the subject of satires, due to his lack of spectacle or participation in the pompous dazzle of previous emperors. He ordered a 5-year review period for every tax collector to dissuade corruption, and instated various policy reforms worthy of praise, including lifting certain taxes imposed exclusively on Jews and pagans. But it is not his imperial policies which made him the subject of so much scholarship, but his religious reforms. Julian did not shine on every front, however. His reinstatement of animal sacrifice at pagan altars seemed to contradict his advocacy for moderation. But let it not be forgotten that every sacrificed animal was either eaten by the community or a small portion was burned for the gods. Although, unlike his predecessors who condemned to death those who did not perform the proper temporal sacrifices, Julian merely looked on when Christians failed to worship at pagan temples. He saw not to make Christianity illegal and opposed violence against them, the kind of violence which saw Bishop George of Cappadocia killed in a pagan riot. Though the bishop was guilty of crimes against the people of Alexandria, Julian still condemned the outcome, saying, "You people dared to rip a human being to pieces just as dogs a wolf." Julian's not unfounded distrust of Christian teachers caused him to enact the one law that overly targeted Christians. This edict forbade all Christians from teaching rhetoric and grammar. His goal appeared to be not letting Christians teach the classics because of their perversion of older doctrines and their obsessive condemnation of anything other than the worship of Jesus. Due to the hypocrisy Julian saw among the Christians in his youth, and his apparent stance that no wild beasts are as dangerous to man as Christians are to one another, it is not difficult to understand why Julian made this law. Quote, "When a man thinks one thing and teaches his pupils another, in my opinion, he fails to educate as he fails to be an honest man. I give them a choice, either not to teach what they do not think is excellent, or if they wish to teach, first they must persuade their pupils that neither Homer nor Hesiod are guilty of impiety, folly, and error." This drew out the passionate hate of Christians, who apparently refused to understand the merit of the edict, despite their certain guttural reaction if in reverse it were pagans teaching Christian scriptures. Gregory and the Christian Socrates certainly were deprived of one too many smooth bowel movements for how fervent their hatred for this edict was. But the Christians have failed to convince history of Julian's villainy, much as many of their early apologists failed to profess their religion without entangling the mortal man of Jesus with the unbegotten God of the universe. All the same, Julian actually invited many Christian bishops at odds with one another to his palace, so that they might practice the precepts of their great teacher. The Christians' famous petty quarrels over theological matters, exemplified in the Arius heresy, however, hinted that this was hopelessly unlikely. In truth, we do not know how sincere Julian was when he recalled from banishment all those heretical Christian sects which had previously been shunned from the empire. For when the Arians and Novatians and others returned, they resumed dividing up the Christians much as they had always done. This could have been a deliberate maneuver by Julian to sow further discontent among Christians already at each other's throats, but this is uncertain. Non-Orthodox Christians banished by Julian's predecessor could now return to their homes. But now the pagan temples were free of the fear of imperially mandated executions. Julian even espoused plans for rebuilding Solomon's temple and restoring Jerusalem to the Jews. And now the story causes us to fade out of our admittedly limited biographical sketch and examine the words of the philosopher emperor himself, so as to understand what visions stirred this unlikely emperor's mind as he took the mantle of Augustus. But more, what divine light he had configured in his heart since his youth, stoked in the mysteries and his association with Neoplatonists, and safeguarded up until he could now finally literalize his own development of the great theologies passed down from Plato himself. First, we must treat with Julian's famous treatise against the Galileans, written in 362, and proceed to his less tense and most well-regarded works, the Hymn to King Helios and the Hymn to the Mother of the Gods, wherein Julian demonstrates his excellent Hellenic philosophy as refined through the Neoplatonic schools and the mystical orientation of the mysteries. Julian's Against the Galileans survives only as a part of the first of 3 books. What does survive comes through the portions of the treatise which were retained in later Christian rebuttals. It is surprising in hindsight that so much of the treatise survives at all. Julian calls Christians the Galileans and Jesus the Nazarene to highlight the small and local origins of the creed of fishermen, opening with, It is, I think, expedient to set forth to all mankind the reasons by which I was convinced that the fabrication of the Galileans is a fiction of men composed by wickedness. He warns anyone who would argue in opposition to him not to bring countercharges until they have defended their own views. The Galileans, he says, picked up the worst from more ancient religions, allying with the Jewish scriptures instead of the Hellenic, yet not even adhering to the Jewish tradition, but selecting as they may, they followed a way of their own. For they have not accepted a single admirable or important doctrine of those that are either held by us Hellenes or by the Hebrews who derived them from Moses. But from both religions they have gathered what has been engrafted like powers of evil, as it were, on these nations, atheism from the Jewish levity, and a sordid and slovenly way of living from our indolence and vulgarity, and they desire that this should be called the noblest worship of the gods. Julian regards the knowledge of God as innate to the human race, an inherent yearning that trumps the belief of any externality. Quote, now that the human race possesses its knowledge of God by nature, and not from teaching, is proved to us first of all by the universal yearning for the divine that is in all men, whether private persons or communities, whether considered as individuals or as races. For all of us, without being taught, have attained to a belief in some sort of divinity, though it is not easy for all men to know the precise truth about it, nor is it possible for those who do know it to tell it to all men. He admits, now it is true that the Hellenes invented their myths about the gods, incredible and monstrous stories. Kronos swallows his children, Zeus sleeps with his own mother, and much more. But Julian posits that the Hebrews have done much the same with their own mythology. Only the Christians who have adopted the Jewish myths make the mistake of taking their own lore literally while condemning the Greeks, who were not all as predisposed to literalism as their Christian critics argued. Julian demonstrates the God in Genesis was selfish, jealous, and envious, equipped, therefore, with human qualities no less than the Greek gods were by the old poets. Julian compares Plato's to Moses' cosmology, but where the books of Moses lack detail and explanation, Plato's descriptions satisfy many questions from the beginning, namely that of the immortality of the soul and the hierarchy of deities. The Jewish authors, however, do not even take a risk to explain their own angels. Julian wonders why the Christians believe so readily in the account of the Tower of Babel and in God's purposeful confounding of men's languages, and yet they do not believe in Homer's tale of the Alodai, who wanted to stack 3 mountains so they might scale the heavens. Of course, Julian never once submits to the literal interpretation of such a myth, but for the Christians to make such an error they would also believe the Hebrew God was afraid of what an increasingly skilled mankind could do. Gods are not supposed to be capable of being afraid if they are true gods. And on that point, Julian notices the Bible does not proclaim its God to be that of the whole world, but that of the people of Israel, a variable which is also subject to change. It is odd to Julian how the Christians accept the Hebrew Bible as their foundational prophetic scriptures and yet believe in a wholly different God, and in a Savior who is demonstrably not the alleged coming Messiah of the Hebrews. But they want the Greeks and Romans to believe in this God as well, one who never protected them but rather only the Jews. Moreover, Julian recognizes how Moses plainly taught that other gods existed and were subordinate to the Creator, and yet he never explains what these gods are. Julian references the Hebrew Bible where God confesses to be a jealous and all-consuming fire, saying, if a man is jealous and envious, you think him blameworthy, whereas if God is called jealous, you think it a divine quality. And now Julian engages in the my God versus your God rhetorical contest, finding the Christians and Jews in possession of no ancient tradition or divine art, whereas the Greeks have built out the science of the heavenly bodies, first developed by the Babylonians. The Egyptians mastered geometry and the Phoenicians arithmetic. Passing on to the more immediate subject of the Galileans, some of Julian's issues with Christendom are narrowed down in the following, quote, "Yet Jesus, who won over the least worthy of you, has been known by name for but little more than 300 years, and during his lifetime he accomplished nothing worth hearing of, unless anyone thinks that to heal crooked and blind men, and to exorcise those who were possessed by evil demons in the villages of Bethsaida and Bethany, can be classified as a mighty achievement. As for purity of life, you do not know whether he so much as mentioned it, but you emulate the rages and the bitterness of the Jews, overturning temples and altars, and you slaughtered not only those of us who remained true to the teachings of their fathers, but also men who are as much astray as yourselves, heretics, because they did not wail over the corpse in the same fashion as yourselves. But these are rather your own doings, for nowhere did either Jesus or Paul hand down to you such commands. The reason for this is that they never even hoped that you would one day attain to such power as you have." Julian presents arguments against the false interpretation of Jesus as co-equal to God, or the incarnated God of the Hebrew Bible, and wonders where in fact the Christians found or manufactured this interpretation, or why they have so strongly asserted it so as to become an unavoidable dogma of their faith, and why, if this is true, the Jews did not follow him. Quote, "But Jesus, who commanded the spirits and walked on the sea and drove out demons, and as you yourselves assert, made the heavens and the earth. For no one of his disciples ventured to say this concerning him save only John, and he did not say it clearly or distinctly. Still, let us at any rate admit that he said it. Could not this Jesus change the dispositions of his own friends and kinsfolk to the end that he might save them?" In this way, the Christians have laced themselves up with the Hebrew tradition, even though the Hebrews do not accept the confounding of their native teachings with those of Jesus. And yet the Christians must now rush to the defense of the Hebrew Bible on theological matters to support their own claims. This is certainly an undesirable burden that the Christians apparently accepted in order to guise their new systems as something more ancient and well-founded. Nevertheless, where were the Christians satisfied even by their own doctrines? Quote, "If the reading of your own scriptures is sufficient for you, why do you nibble at the learning of the Hellenes? Yet you are so misguided and foolish that you regard those chronicles of yours as divinely inspired, while on the other hand, writings by whose aid men can acquire courage, wisdom, and justice, these you ascribe to Satan and to those who serve Satan. Julian marvels that Paul taught how adulterers, idolaters, thieves, extortioners, and drunkards were barred from inheriting the kingdom of heaven unless they performed the smallest act of washing themselves with water and sanctified themselves in the name of Jesus. Julian knows water does not heal leprosy any more than it cleanses the adulterer of his disorder. Thus Julian accuses the Galileans of attracting the basest persons into their faith, promising much to their converted pupils who need hardly take matters into their own hands and to earn anything divine for themselves. For what is divine in them, it seems, comes only by way of Jesus, a man who lived and died as any man does. And shame on those Christians who had already persecuted believers in their own faith, who, with such minor variations in doctrine of belief, have earned criticism as the followers of Satan. Julian recognizes the caution with which John proclaims Jesus to be God, in order to appease those Christians in Greek and Italian towns who had already succumbed to such a belief. And yet John seems to forget himself when he contradicts himself in saying, "No man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him." Many more disagreements and tensions within the Christian writings are recognized by Julian, which are still, nearly 2,000 years later, the same theological problems non-Christians point to in order to defend their disbelief in every Christian dogma. Julian no doubt had much more to say in his arguments, but we possess only part of one of his 3 treatises. But it is much more than his surviving writings that showcase the immediacy of Julian's Hellenic revival. An inscription discovered in 1969 in the Upper Jordan Valley, engraved on half a column of limestone, regards Emperor Julian as the restorer and liberator of temples. Saturninus Secundus dedicated an inscription to him in Ankara, which included, "To the master of the entire world, Julian Augustus, who traveled from the Britannic Ocean to the Tigris in one summer." Inscriptions from Casse, Thibalis, Peneus, Mursa, and Churchill are clear epigraphic evidence for the broader support of Julian's revival socially and geographically. We have now to wonder what Julian's own philosophy aspired to, and what it might have developed toward were it not that his fate came, as we will see, at such an early time. In his hymn to King Helios, a sun god from ancient Greece, Julian recalls how in his youth he was overtaken by the divine light and driven to wonder at the heavens and the gods and all, despite having never picked up any literature as of yet to direct his thoughts here or there. Julian regards himself as a follower of Helios, who is the common father of all mankind, both in the god's visible capacity as the sun itself and in his invisible capacity as the light which radiates the living universe. Quote, "For well I know that no one in the world could attain to a description that would be worthy of him, and not to fail of a certain measure of success in his praises is the greatest height to which human beings can attain in the power of utterance. But as for me, may Hermes, the god of eloquence, stand by my side to aid me." Now the doctrine of the Phoenicians, who were wise and learned in sacred lore, declared that the rays of light everywhere diffused are the undefiled incarnation of pure mind. And in harmony with this is our theory, seeing that light itself is incorporeal, if one should regard its fountainhead not as corporeal, but as the undefiled activity of mind pouring light into its own abode. Here we recall that Julian was a student of Iamblichus's teachings, who he calls the beloved of the gods, and names as the source for what he here is setting down. Other allusions to Iamblichus's teachings hint at Julian coming into contact with the Hermetic doctrines as well. For all his understanding of the esoteric light, the nous, and the craftsman god, we have found to be familiar aspects of the Hermetic system. Quote, "For what, speaking generally, could be seen, were it not first brought into touch with light, in order that, I suppose, it may receive a form as matter is brought under the hand of a craftsman." Julian makes no great deviation from his Neoplatonic familiars, reckoning about the poets like other great philosophers before him, for, along with what is inspired, they contain much also that is merely human. Julian, we must remember, is careful to omit other teachings he knows of, in order not to commit the sacrilegious acts of revealing the mysteries. And in some manner of conclusion he writes of Helios as King of the All, whose blessings have shone from eternity. In like manner he regards Helios as the god whose gifts he, quote, "bestows on our souls when he frees them from the body and then lifts them up on high to the region of those substances that are akin to the god, and the fineness and vigor of his divine rays, which are assigned as a sort of vehicle for the safe descent of our souls into this world of generation." Finally, we pass to his hymn to the Mother of the Gods, which he opens by asking, quote, "Ought I to say something on this subject also? And shall I write about things not to be spoken of, and divulge what ought not to be divulged? Shall I utter the unutterable? Who is Attis or Gallus? Who is the Mother of the Gods, and what is the manner of their ritual of purification?" In this treatise, Julian mentions many mysteries, including that of the Chaldeans and their seven-rayed god. He perpetually prevents himself from weighing into matters too sacred to be profaned by words. But perhaps we can pass over the whole of the treatise itself, and let the hymn he includes at the end speak to the nature of Julian's reverential theosophy. Quote, "O Mother of gods and men, thou that art the assessor of Zeus and sharest his throne, O source of the intellectual gods, that pursuest thy course with the stainless substance of the intelligible gods, that does receive from them all the common cause of things, and does thyself bestow it on the intellectual gods, O life-giving goddess that are the counsel and the providence and the creator of our souls! O thou that loves the great Dionysus, and did save Attis when exposed at birth, and did lead him back when he had descended into the cave of the nymph! O thou that givest all good things to the intellectual gods, and fills with all things this sensible world, and with all the rest gives us all things good! Do thou grant to all men happiness, and that highest happiness of all, the knowledge of the gods, and grant to the Roman people in general that they may cleanse themselves of the stain of impiety. Grant them a blessed lot, and help them to guide their empire for many thousands of years. And for myself, grant me as fruit of my worship of thee that I may have true knowledge in the doctrines about the gods. Make me perfect in theurgy, and in all that I undertake, in the affairs of the state and the army. Grant me virtue and good fortune, and that the close of my life may be painless and glorious, in the good hope that it is to you, the gods, that I journey. And Emperor Julian's journey to his gods would hasten, as it were, when he arrived in Antioch in July of 362, where his half-brother Gallus sowed discontentment years earlier. Julian had come to be known as the Apostate to his Christian enemies by now, for his apparent abandonment of a faith into which he was never fully invested. He was regarded unfavorably by many in Antioch, perhaps for not strutting out the normal spectacle of a true emperor of the purple. Julian, with his outward humility, wide, watery eyes, and proclivity to orate somewhat esoterically in public, in humble clothes, or in battle to his soldiers, he did not live up to the theocratic residue of Constantine the Great, and he was wary, however respectful and boastful, of the folly of Alexander the Great. But he was not wary enough. After almost 8 months in Antioch, Julian and his armies march into their Persian campaign against Sapor II of the Sasanian Empire, bound to siege the city of Ctesiphon, against the advice of oracles and omens, such as a great meteorite lighting up the sky at midnight while Julian was suddenly prompted to step out of his tent. But Julian did not waver at this sign. When the Romans won a short battle outside the city of Ctesiphon, they soon understood the siege of the city would not be fruitful, and to dismiss with the procrastination, Julian burned his fleet of ships in the Tigris and pushed deep into the Persian Empire, led astray by a scorched earth campaign until Julian's forces were gnawed away at by the Sassanid attackers. Julian fought now beside his troops like a warrior prince of old, and when his rear guard was assailed outside the city of Samarra, Julian, now totally unarmored from a scouting ride in the heat, snatched up a shield and rushed to the aid of his troops, as the Sassanids pushed through his center with a massive charge of cavalry and war elephants, which Julian, deep in the fighting now, remained caught up in until the barbarians were pressed into retreat. And in the words of Ammianus, quote, "The emperor flew from one danger to another, and our light-armed troops took the offensive, hacking backs and legs of the Persians and their monstrous beasts as they turned tail. Julian, throwing caution to the winds, thrust himself boldly into the fight, shouting and waving his arms to make it clear that the enemy had been routed, and to encourage his men to a furious pursuit. His escort of guards, who had been scattered in the melee, were crying out to him from all sides to avoid the mass of fugitives as he would the collapse of a badly built roof, when suddenly a cavalry spear grazed his arm, pierced his ribs, and lodged in the lower part of his liver. He tried to pull it out with his right hand, but both sides of the spear were sharp, and he felt his fingers cut to the bone. He fell from his horse, there was a rush to the spot, and he was carried to camp. While in his camp and faint, Julian calls for his sword and armor, but lacks the strength to rally after losing so much blood. And his friends and philosophic comrades now gather sorrowfully in the emperor's tent, heads bowed collectively at the news of his impending death. Julian's last words, recorded by Ammianus, would prove his fearless welcome of death. And among his final words he said, "Always keeping in mind that the aim of a just sovereign is the advantage and safety of his subjects, I have been always, as you know, inclined to peace, eradicating all licentiousness, that great corruptress of things and manners, by every part of my own conduct, and I am glad to feel that in whatever instances the Republic, like an imperious mother, has exposed me deliberately to danger, I have stood firm, inured to brave all fortuitous disturbing events. Nor am I ashamed to confess that I have long known, from prophecy, that I should fall by the sword, and therefore do I venerate the everlasting God that I now die, not by any secret treachery, nor by a long or severe disease, or like a condemned criminal, but I quit the world with honor, fairly earned, in the midst of a career of nourishing glory. And in the company of the philosophers Maximus and Priscus, Julian shares a secret discourse on the nature of the soul, and dies at the age of 32, after ruling as emperor for only 16 months. After Julian's death, his Christian successor Jovian undid all of Julian's reforms related to Christianity, and the last hope of pagan religion would become, for many, little more than an intriguing footnote in Western religious development, marred by much negative Christian writing. It is fruitless but nonetheless tantalizing to wonder what might have come to be if Julian had lived. His death at 32 deprived the world of a great chance at redeeming paganism, producing a more respectable Christianity, and could be argued, as it was by Zosimus, to have removed a final obstacle from the path of Christianity becoming the official state religion of the empire. It has always been a launching ground for the imagination to wonder what could have been if Julian lived. While it is safe to leave this a mystery, we might at least speculate in one instance how Julian's survival could have affected Christian development. In the year 362, Athanasius, a controversial Nicene Christian church leader in Alexandria, had returned to the Egyptian city after being banished by Constantius, perhaps thinking himself protected under Julian's new edict allowing formerly banished Christians to return to their home countries. But Julian issued an edict once again banishing Athanasius from Alexandria, naming Athanasius an enemy of the gods, and there was a clear and immediate hatred between the two men. Biblical scholars still point to Athanasius's Easter letter of 367 as the source for the list of the 27 New Testament texts in the same order that we still use today. Athanasius's first act after returning to Alexandria upon Julian's death was to reaffirm the terms of the Nicene Creed, which contains the famous dogmas of Jesus as the only begotten Son of God, the God from God, and the Virgin Mary, and the belief in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. While no compelling evidence exists to show Julian would have lived on to persecute Christians with violence during his reign, that he would not have tolerated Athanasius's presence in Alexandria is almost a certainty. Julian left behind a trove of letters and writings for any who wished to delve deeper into this controversial character, who was, as history will ever show, the last emperor initiate. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and consider supporting the Patreon, linked below in the description. This helps keep the channel active and contributes to the quality of the work. Thank you.